Welcome to the Next Generation Rockstars podcast. If you are trying to figure out how do you recruit and retain this next generation of rockstar talent, well, you are in the right place. So today's episode is a little bit different than the norm. Today's episode is actually going to be a replay of Fran Katsoudas, who is the Chief People Officer for Cisco Systems. Now, the reason I'm replaying Fran's episode today is because we have a celebration on our hands. You see, just a couple of days ago, Cisco was named as the #1 great place to work for 2019. Now, I had the honor of interviewing Fran when she and Cisco were named to the list for 2018. They came in at number 3, and we had a great conversation then talking about the importance of your people, really, and why they're important and how they drive innovation and change and transformation from the inside out. And Fran really shared with us a lot of really incredible insights about how she sees the world and, of course, then how she influences her team to see the world. You know, Cisco has been on the list now for 23 straight years of being a great place to work. They've been, up until now, the highest they had ever made it was number 3, but they'd actually dropped all the way down to 90. And I think that there have been some really big ups and down years. But one thing that we've seen consistently with Cisco is that they have been very intentional about their people. They have been very intentional about not only recognizing that the world is changing, but the business world is changing. And so they've taken that into account, and they've taken into account that the workforce is coming in, they are changing, but so are the skills that are necessary in order to compete and in order to innovate. And Cisco, as we all know, is a global technological juggernaut. They are out there competing at the highest stages and levels of business. And so that ability to compete in that innovative space is really paramount to everything they do, whether it's new products, whether it's new sales motions and techniques, or whether it's marketing to their clients. But they really began to recognize that there is an incredible customer journey. But beyond the customer journey, the people that are really driving that journey at every point, whether it's R&D, it's marketing, it's sales, it's deliverables, is really the people. So it was important to focus on the employee journey. So listen into this episode, learn from Fran on how she has led Cisco to become #1 on the Great Places to Work list, but also how she has intentionally set the standard for how they're going to treat their people and how they're going to guide them along in this employee journey. Enjoy the episode. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Next Generation Rockstars podcast. I am your host, Amanda Hammett, and I am thrilled to have you today. Today's episode is really special. One, because I am sharing this episode. It is a joint interview between myself and my husband, Gene Hammett, who is the host of the popular business podcast, Leaders in the Trenches. And together, we had the opportunity to sit down in person and interview Fran Katsoudas, who is the Chief People Officer at Cisco Systems. Now, one of the most interesting things that came out of this interview, and trust me, there were multiple, but just the focus on developing leaders and the way in which Cisco is doing it. And trust me, they are doing some really innovative and different ways. There were a few stories that Fran shared during this interview that both Gene and I were really taken aback and just awed at how they're approaching developing their leaders. And so I think that this is something that each and every leader should think about and take notes from, because Fran she's a leader. She is a pioneer. She is looking at developing teams. She is looking at developing individuals for 75,000 employees around the globe. And she is doing a fantastic job. So I hope you take lots of notes. And here is Fran Katsoudas with Cisco Systems.
Hi, this is Gene with Leaders in the Trenches, and also we have Amanda.
Hi, this is Amanda Hammett, and this is with the Next Generation Rockstars.
And if you don't know, Amanda's my wife, so she's been on the podcast before in episode 100, but we have a very special guest today. We have Fran Katsoudas with Cisco. I will let her introduce herself because the title is not that hard. It's the Chief People Officer, which is much easier to say than Chief Human Resources Officer. Fran, tell us a little bit about you and who you serve.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my title changed about 4 years ago, and I think that's part of the shift to really focusing on people and experience. And so I think the people that I serve are all of our employees at Cisco, and I take that incredibly seriously. I think it's one of the most amazing jobs. And in my role, I'm helping to hopefully create amazing careers for 75,000 employees.
I think it's a much better title.
I do too. I think that it really reflects the culture that you guys have built at Cisco.
I'm going to let the audience know a little bit more about my research, and you too, Fran. The key thing is I study growth companies, and I asked over 300 leaders about what's the most important thing to growth. Is it customer first or employee first? And 94% of smaller companies will say it's employee first. So I probably know where you are on this, but where do you rank on that?
Yeah, you know this. These things go hand in hand, and I think if you ask the question 5 or 7 years ago, the 94% could be customer first. It could have been, right? I think now all of us realize that when you take care of your people, they take care of the customer, and they do the right thing, not only for the customers, but for the community as well. And I think that's a little bit of the shift even for large companies like Cisco.
Well, we're talking to you because you made the list, and how many years in a row have you made the Great Places to Work list?
So we've been on the list for 22 years.
Okay, they put people first.
Apparently, yes, very much so. I mean, 22 years, that's amazing. And has anybody else ever reached that pinnacle?
I do think that there are a few other companies that have, but I'll tell you because I feel it's important to say. In 22 years, we've had some really phenomenal years. Like I think the highest that we've been is number 3. And then we had years that were more challenged. And we talked about this the other night. We were at number 90 at one point. And so it's been fascinating for us to be at those numbers. And with each year and every level of recognition, I think there's a question around what do we need to do? And sometimes that's been harder and sometimes a little easier.
Well, I want to direct our conversation into a topic that a lot of companies are struggling with. This is big companies, medium-sized companies, small companies, and that's retaining key employees. So this is, other words, retention. Why is retention so important for a business today?
Yeah, because we know there's nothing better than having amazing people and teams. And so I think we all talk about retention because we don't want to lose that. And especially when you have something that's working, it's just so critical. The other thing that we recognize is there's really unique skills that are out there. And from a technology space, skills are changing. Like the life of a skill at this moment is becoming shorter and shorter. And so I think that's an element of why we talk about retention so much.
So Fran, in your journey of these 22 years on the Great Places to Work, I would imagine that over the years you guys have put in some key projects to really help you retain that talent. And not only retain it, but also reskill it as those skills change.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hesitate a little bit when I think about retention because there's something about that if you're not careful, you can be on your heels a bit. And so rather than putting in retention programs, what I want to put in are amazing programs that allow people to be at their best. And for every employee, they have some very unique things going on at work and at home. And there's different paths that we have. And so I feel like our job is to architect these potential paths for people. There was a point probably about 7 or 8 years ago where I was spending so much time talking about retention. And I don't think it was the right dialogue. What I needed to be talking about is how do we help people be at their absolute best? How do we help them work on teams where they feel like their work is having tremendous impact? So that's a little bit of the shift that we've been through.
It seems like that's more of a shift from retention is like kind of a reactive to what's going on, whereas you're getting more proactive.
That's what I should have said, yes. You did. You said that.
A key question, you just came off the stage, great conversation, kind of panel of what Cisco is doing to move forward in the next 22 years. But you mentioned a project, I don't know what it's called, but you ask employees about what do they love and what do they loathe. So how often do you do that, and why do you do that?
Yeah, so there's technology that we put in place, I think it's almost 3 years ago, that Marcus Buckingham created. ADP recently acquired this company. And so every week we go on our phones, there's an app that we have, and we share our priorities for the week. We share what we loved and what we loathed from the previous week, and then how we feel about whether or not we're really working in a way that demonstrates our strengths, and then the level of value or impact that we think we're having. And it's something that candidly will take me about 5 minutes. I do it weekly, and Chuck Robbins, our CEO, reviews my check-in, and then he'll provide feedback. And so if you think about it, at its core, what it's doing is it's allowing us to quickly connect on the work. And then there's something a lot more powerful, is it's giving Chuck insights through what I love around what really fuels me as an employee, and then what I loathe, which is those things that drain. And I think as our role as leaders is to really do more of the love and help our employees on the loathe side of the house.
And I will say that I've worked with some of your leaders, and they have all had that exact same response to that app and to that feedback on a weekly basis, and that they really have enjoyed being able to see, okay, where am I missing the ball? Where can I help my people more? And I think that that's a major cultural just benefit that everybody's enjoyed.
It's so funny, Amanda, because everyone's different, right? And so as a leader, you start to understand your people in different ways. Like there are some members of my team where they rarely put anything in loathe. So when something is there, I need to get to them. I need to call them, I need to meet with them, because I know there's something really heavy for them. So it's kind of fun, because as leaders, I think you get to know your people, and I would never expect that they use it the same way. I think that's wonderful, but we learn a lot, which is good.
How often do you do it?
I probably do it 3 out of 4 weeks. So I will, sometimes if I'm traveling, I'll miss a week, or if I'm with Chuck, but we ask people to do it at least, we try for weekly, at least every other week. And it's just a powerful way for us to connect.
I want to be clear about this, because Fran, you talked about you filling out this and you report to the CEO.
That's right.
But how many thousand people are actually doing this program?
Yeah, so we've rolled it out to all employees around the globe. Now, I'll tell you the number I really, really care about. When we first rolled it out, we were seeing employees enter their information, and we could see that in some cases a manager wouldn't read it. And that's pretty heartbreaking. Like, think about it. You go through this exercise of putting in your priorities you love and loathe, and you're probably like sitting there going, what are they going to say? Like, what are they going to say to that? And we worked with our leaders, and now that rate is 92%. So 92% of the check-ins are read. And we know that for the 8%, sometimes they're read after the week. But that's really important. I call that the attention rate. And it's a question around our leaders paying attention to our people.
Absolutely. And that's one of the biggest things in my work that I see with next generation talent, is that they want to have their voices heard. And this is a wonderful, beautiful, almost immediate way to do that.
I'm going to switch the conversation a little bit. Back to my research, I study fast-growing companies, and one of the core factors of that has been transparency. Mm-hmm. And the word I actually use, because a lot of these fast-growing companies are adamant about it, is they use radical transparencies. And that's what you guys said on stage. So what is radical transparency in terms of leadership?
I think it's sharing what's not working. I think it's sharing those places where you perhaps did something wrong. I think it's just driving an honest discussion. Sometimes I think it's actually more about the listening part for us from a senior leadership perspective. In January of this year, and it was important to us, we wanted to kick off the year again with a signal of what was important to us. We actually shared with all of our employees at a company meeting, we do them monthly, all of the employee relations cases that we've had for the first half of our fiscal year. And we shared with them, cases around bullying and harassment, cases where perhaps someone felt like they were not being heard. And then we shared with our employees what we had done as a result of those cases. And the response to that, I think, will drive more transparency from our employees in sharing their own stories. And it's funny, I've had situations where I'll get out of the elevator and an employee will say, hey, that story, that was real. Like, I've had that happen to me. And so that's a little bit of what we're really pushing towards, because I think when we have that, we'll be better as a company in every way.
Follow-up question to that is, a lot of people are interested in transparency and some people are committed. What would you say to those people that are just merely interested?
Well, I get it. I get it, because it's hard. It's really hard. And we were just on stage with Mark Chandler, who is our general counsel at Cisco. And he's an amazing partner in that, because I think what you have to be willing to do is understand that in some cases, transparency will lead to more conversation and work to be done. But the issues are there. And so I would say that the faster that you can address the issues, the more that you're going to be able to move on. And so I think we have to move to committed in this regard.
So I'd like to switch gears a little bit. Something that came up during that panel was brought up by Amy Chang, but it's something that I've actually seen also and heard from the leadership that I've worked with, is the caring, the culture of caring that you have cultivated. But Amy specifically said it comes from you directly and your team, and it trickles down. And I love that. And so I'd like to know a little bit more about what benefit do you feel that that's given not only to you and your team, but also overall to your 75,000 employees?
Well, she was very kind. I mean, it really does start with our CEO, Chuck Robbins. I think he's someone that in every engagement you see his passion and caring. And it comes from our employees. And I'm a big believer in this magic of when things happen at the top and then throughout the organization. A lot of times I refer to it as the sandwich. When we were doing work in August, identifying our principles as a company, we went around to all of our employees around the globe, or to focus groups, and what came out is they feel that we're a caring company. And so one of our principles is all around how we give of ourselves. I think, my team sets a tone, which I absolutely love, and that's something I'm incredibly proud of, and I think they do an amazing job. What we work really hard at is, how do we connect the business strategy to everything related to culture and people and organization, and at the same time be there for one another.
How do you transform leaders to really think about an increased caring?
I think leaders need to see it in action. It's really hard. I mean, I think we've all been in situations where perhaps you see someone saying something on the stage and you think, I don't think that's really how it is, right? And there's nothing worse than that. And sometimes I feel really fortunate. I started at Cisco in the contact center. I came in early in career, and I answered phones. I remember talking to like 80 customers a day about their technical issues. And I think sometimes when you start at a company at a very entry level, you see so many different types of leaders, and you see some really good examples. So the first thing I would say is that leaders have to see it role modeled at every level in the company, and there can't be an exception, and you have to call it when there is, which is incredibly hard. And you have to teach, something that we've done recently. It sounds really funny. We've brought actors in to a leadership class, and we've had the actors hand an employee a card that says, your employee is talking over everyone in a team meeting, go. And basically you have to have a conversation where you're helping your employee understand that that's going on. And so these are real life experiences, and so we're trying to coach and help and talk through as much as we can and make it real.
That's pretty interesting. I've never heard of.
I have literally never heard of that. That's
bringing
great.
in actors. Fran, you talked on stage about some work you've done on forming of teams and what makes good teams. I've read some studies from Google as well. I'm sure you've probably read these as well. What can you tell us about best teams?
Yeah, so for us it was really fascinating. We went out to the business about 3 years ago and we said, identify your best teams. And they identified about 97 teams across the company. And we studied the 97 teams, and then we studied a control group of 200 teams. And sure enough, we could see a difference. And honestly, we didn't know if that was going to be the case or not. And so the delta that we saw was in 3 key areas. On the best teams, we could see that employees were playing to their strengths. And when employees play to their strengths, they're a lot more creative, they're a lot more productive, so it's pretty amazing for us. The second thing that we saw, and I think this was in the Google study as well, is that on teams where teammates feel like, hey, my teammates have my back, there's a big difference from a safety and trust perspective. That's incredibly important for growth and innovation as well. And then the last thing that we saw is on our best teams, teams were aligned on how they were going to win together. They had some shared values as it relates to where they were going. And so those were the 3 differentiators between the best teams and the control group. And then that became really the philosophy for a lot of what we do from a teams and leaders.
I think that that's really important, especially from my perspective with the young talent, is that finding those good leaders, because that is one of the things that I coach university students to think about, is really look for that good first leader, that person that can really help you play to your strengths or figure out what your strengths are. Because coming out of college, you may not know exactly what you're good at, or you may develop new skills. And being with a leader who can help you do that and can guide you is beautiful. It's wonderful.
So, Fran, we've been guiding most of this through questions. Is there something that we haven't asked you about that you feel like really would improve the employee experience?
There's something I'll share with you that we're focused on at the moment. And it's something where we're learning a lot and we're developing. And there's this belief that we have in something called conscious culture. And the belief set is that when you have a conscious culture, every single employee is a leader within the company, and every single employee is conscious of their role in shaping the company and shaping our culture. There's 3 things that we're focused on within this. The first is the environment. This is why, by the way, we shared the employee relations cases, because we want to have a really honest dialogue around the environment. The second pillar is all about the characteristics and the behaviors, and this is where our principles live. And then the last piece is really around what's your day-to-day experience? Because I think if you have amazing principles, but again, your day-to-day experience is different, that's a big problem. And so for us, that's going to be our focus. But we're doing a lot of experimentation and pilots, and we're learning. And it's something that we'll be happy to talk about in the future as well.
Awesome. That's really fantastic.
Well, we're going to wrap this up. I want one final question. I've heard a lot today, something that I don't hear much in a corporate setting, which is mindset. I have heard this from my beginnings of becoming a coach. It was like, I guess, 9 years ago, and I didn't know what it was before that because I was sort of an engineer. And I just get the work done, and that's the kind of leader I was. But when I went through this, I realized that the way I was thinking had a huge impact on what I saw and what I did and how I engaged. So, what do you do to talk about mindsets, and how do you work with your leaders on that?
Yeah, I do think it's incredibly important. One of the things that we do is we talk a lot about servant leadership. And I think that's how you start to shift the mindset, because basically what you're saying is that as a leader, you are in service to the people around you, and that is such a different lens than get the work done. One of my peers, she did this first, and I loved it, Maria Martinez. She showed an org chart, and she was at the very bottom of the org chart. And that's a great example of how you start to shift mindset by just signaling, no. All of the people that I support, they are the important folks in this. And so there are things like that I think are incredibly important. And then again, I think just being willing to have conversations that make us think, ask questions that'll make us really pause. I think those are all elements of how you change mindset.
So this wraps up a special episode of Leaders in the Trenches and
The Next Generation Rock Stars.
Thank you, Fran, for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of The Next Generation Rockstars, where we have discussed all about recruiting and retaining that next generation of talent. So I'm guessing that you probably learned a tremendous amount from this week's Rockstar Leader. And if that is the case, don't keep me a secret. Share this episode with the world, But really, share it with your friends, with your colleagues, because they also need to learn how to recruit and retain this next generation of talent, because these skills are crucial to business success moving forward. Now, of course, I want you to keep up to date every single week as we are dropping each and every episode. So be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast platform of your choice, and you will see the next generation rock stars show up just for you.